Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. The night my father humiliated me, I was wearing the happiest smile of my life. At least, that's what everyone kept telling me. The restaurant glowed with soft amber lights, the kind that made everything look warmer, kinder, more forgiving than reality. My fiancé Daniel's hand rested gently over mine under the table, his thumb tracing small circles on my palm, like he was silently reminding me that this moment was ours, that nothing could take it away. But even as I laughed with our guests and thanked relatives for their blessings, there was a knot tightening slowly inside my chest. It had been there all evening, coiling tighter every time I glanced across the room at my father. He sat stiffly at the far end of the table, his posture straight, his jaw locked, his eyes scanning the room as though he were attending an obligation rather than celebrating his daughter's engagement. He hadn't smiled once, not when Daniel's mother hugged him warmly, not when the waiter brought out the cake decorated with delicate white roses, not even when I had stood up earlier to thank everyone for coming. My father had never been a warm man. Growing up, affection from him was as rare as rain in a drought. He believed in discipline, control, and appearances. Love, in his mind, was measured in sacrifices and expectations, not in words or gentle gestures. And for most of my life, I had tried desperately to earn that love. I was never the daughter he wanted. I wasn't the confident, graceful, effortlessly charming woman he imagined presenting proudly to the world. I was quiet, thoughtful, a little awkward in crowds. I stumbled over words when I was nervous. I preferred books to parties. I chose a modest career instead of chasing prestige. And worst of all, in his eyes, I had always been too sensitive. Life is hard, he used to say whenever I cried as a child. No one respects weakness. So I learned to swallow my feelings. I learned to smile through discomfort. I learned to tell myself that one day, if I worked hard enough, if I became successful enough, if I proved I was worthy enough, he would finally look at me with pride. The night of my engagement, I thought that day had finally come. Daniel was everything my father should have admired. He was successful, respected, calm, and kind. He came from a good family. He treated me with a gentleness I had never known growing up. He listened when I spoke. He valued my opinions. He loved me not in spite of my sensitivity, but because of it. When he proposed, I cried so hard I couldn't even answer at first. He had laughed softly, wiping my tears, saying, "I love that you feel everything so deeply. It's one of the most beautiful things about you." Those words had healed something in me that had been wounded since childhood. And when I told my father about the engagement, he had simply nodded and said, "If he knows what he's doing, then fine." It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. And for my father, that silence was the closest thing to acceptance I had ever received. That's why, on the night of our engagement celebration, I still held hope. After dinner, Daniel's brother tapped a glass with a spoon, smiling. "Time for toasts," he announced. One by one, friends and family stood up to share stories, blessings, and jokes. Daniel's mother spoke about how happy she was to welcome me into their family. My best friend talked about our childhood memories. Even my younger cousin made a sweet, nervous speech about how she looked up to me. Each word filled me with warmth. Then someone called out, "The father of the bride should say something." And suddenly, all eyes turned toward my father. My stomach dropped. He rose slowly from his seat, straightening his jacket. He picked up his glass, his face unreadable. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he would finally say something kind. Maybe this was the moment I had waited for my entire life. He cleared his throat. "I have watched my daughter grow up," he began, his voice steady, calm. The room fell silent. And then he continued, "She has always been difficult." A small ripple of awkward laughter spread through the room. My smile froze. He didn't stop. She was never strong like other girls, too emotional, too fragile, always needing reassurance. I felt Daniel's hand tighten around mine. My father lifted his glass slightly, his tone sharpening. To be honest, I never thought any man would truly want a woman like her. The words hit me like a physical blow. The room went completely still. I couldn't breathe. And then he added, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear clearly, "So, Daniel, I hope you know what you're getting into." A few people laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke, but I knew it wasn't, because I had heard that tone my entire life, that cold, cutting tone that carried no humor at all. In that moment, I felt something inside me shatter, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a thin piece of glass cracking under pressure after years of being held too tightly. I stared down at the table, afraid that if I looked up, everyone would see the tears already burning in my eyes. But what happened next was something my father never expected, and something that would change our lives forever. For a few seconds after my father spoke, the entire room felt frozen in time. I could hear the faint hum of the restaurant's air conditioner, the soft clink of silverware from a distant table, and the loud, heavy pounding of my own heart inside my ears. My hands had gone cold in Daniel's grasp, and I realized I was gripping his fingers so tightly my knuckles hurt. But I couldn't let go, because in that moment he was the only thing anchoring me to the ground beneath my feet. My father took a slow sip from his glass as though he had just delivered a perfectly normal, respectable speech. His expression was calm, almost satisfied, like he believed he had spoken some difficult truth that everyone else had been too polite to say. I wanted to disappear. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room shifting between us, some shocked, some embarrassed, some pitying. I had lived my entire life fearing exactly this kind of moment where my father's opinion of me would be exposed publicly, undeniable, and humiliating. But what hurt the most wasn't the insult itself. It was the confirmation. All those years I had tried to convince myself that deep down he loved me, that his harshness came from concern, that one day he would finally see me differently. In that moment, I realized that hope had been built on nothing. He truly believed I was unworthy. Before I could stop them, tears blurred my vision. I lowered my head, praying no one would notice. But Daniel noticed. He gently released my hand, and for a split second, I thought he might be letting go entirely. A sudden panic flared inside me, sharp and terrifying. What if my father had been right? What if Daniel felt embarrassed now? What if this moment changed how he saw me? Then Daniel stood up. His chair scraped softly against the floor, and the sound cut through the heavy silence like a blade. He didn't look angry, he didn't look shaken, he looked calm, steady, certain. He took the glass from my father's hand before my father could sit down, setting it carefully on the table. The motion was polite but firm, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to be powerful. Then he turned to face the room. "He'd like to say something," he said. His voice was warm but clear, carrying easily across the silence. He placed one hand lightly on my shoulder. That small touch felt like a shield. He continued, his voice steady, but now filled with an unmistakable emotion that made my chest tighten. "I've heard a lot of beautiful things tonight, but I think there's something important that needs to be said." He paused, looking directly at my father. "With respect," he said, "I don't think you truly know your daughter. A ripple of tension moved through the room. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Daniel continued, his tone still calm, but now filled with a quiet conviction that made my chest tighten. "You call her emotional," he said, "but what I see is someone who feels deeply, who cares deeply, who has more empathy than anyone I've ever met. You call her fragile, but I've watched her face challenges that would break many people, and she never gave up. You say no man would want her?" He stopped for a moment and his hand tightened slightly on my shoulder. "But loving her is the easiest decision I've ever made in my life." The words landed softly, but their impact was enormous. I felt my breath hitch. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt suffocating. It felt attentive, almost protective. Daniel continued, his voice steady, but now carrying unmistakable emotion. "He listens when others speak. He forgives when others hold grudges. He supports the people he loves without expecting anything in return. And if that is what you consider weakness," he shook his head slightly, "then the world needs more weak people like her." My vision blurred again, but this time the tears were different. They weren't born from shame. They came from something I had rarely felt before: validation. Daniel turned slightly toward me, his expression softening. "He didn't choose her despite who she is. He chose her because of who she is." Then he faced my father once more. "And I hope one day you will see her the rest of us do." When he finished speaking, there was still silence for a few seconds. Then someone at another table began clapping softly. Another person joined, and then another. Within moments, the room filled with applause, not loud or celebratory, but warm and supportive, like a collective embrace. I could no longer hold back my tears. They slipped down my cheeks as I covered my mouth, overwhelmed. For the first time in my life, someone had stood between me and my father's harsh words. Someone had defended me without hesitation, without fear, without shame. Daniel sat back down beside me, taking my hand again, and leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You never have to face him alone again," he whispered. His words settled into my heart like a promise. Across the table, my father stood frozen, his face pale, his expression stunned. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen him look uncertain. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. For a man who had always controlled every room he entered, that loss of control was almost surreal to witness. I didn't know then that this moment, the moment when he was publicly confronted, when his view of me was challenged so directly, would haunt him more than anything else he had ever experienced. And I certainly didn't know that later that night he would do something that would shock me even more than his cruel toast. Because the humiliation he intended for me was about to turn back toward him in a way he never saw coming. After the applause faded, the evening tried to return to something that resembled normal. People shifted in their chairs. Waiters resumed moving between tables, and a few relatives began speaking in low voices, as though they were afraid any sudden sound might break the fragile balance that had just settled over the room. But for me, nothing felt normal anymore. My father sat down slowly, his shoulders stiff, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth in front of him. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Daniel. For the first time in my life, he looked small. That realization stirred something complicated inside me. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't even relief. It was a strange, aching mixture of grief and exhaustion. Because I hadn't wanted to defeat him, I had just wanted him to love me. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "Do you want to leave?" he whispered. Part of me did. I wanted to escape the heavy air, the curious glances, the echo of my father's words still ringing painfully in my mind. But another part of me, the part that had spent decades shrinking to avoid conflict, felt something new rising quietly inside my chest. A fragile but steady strength. "No," I whispered back. "I want to stay." It surprised even me. For the rest of the dinner, conversations remained careful and polite. My aunt talked about wedding planning. Daniel's mother tried to lighten the mood with stories from his childhood. A cousin joked nervously about the cake being too pretty to cut. But beneath it all, the tension lingered like a shadow that refused to disappear. My father didn't speak again. He ate in silence, his posture rigid, his face expressionless. Every now and then, I caught him glancing toward me, but the moment I noticed, he would quickly look away. That avoidance hurt in a different way than his harshness ever had. It felt like distance, like a wall finally becoming visible after years of pretending it wasn't there. When the evening finally ended, guests began saying their goodbyes. Many of them hugged me longer than usual, whispering soft words of support. "You're stronger than you know," my best friend murmured as she held me tightly. Daniel's mother cupped my face gently and said, "You are already family to us." Each kind word soothed the sharpest edges of the pain, but it also highlighted something else, the painful contrast between the warmth of others and the coldness of my own father. As people filtered out of the restaurant, I saw him standing alone near the entrance, putting on his coat. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave without saying anything, but I knew if I did, the silence between us would harden into something permanent. So I walked toward him. Each step felt heavy. When I stopped a few feet away, he still didn't look at me. "Dad?" I said softly. The word felt strange in my mouth. He finally raised his eyes, and for a moment I saw something unfamiliar there. Not anger, not disappointment, something closer to discomfort. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said quietly. The word stunned me. A hollow laugh almost escaped my throat, but I swallowed it. Of course, in his mind, the problem wasn't what he had said. It was that he had been challenged. "That's what you think happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened. "You let him speak to me like that, in front of everyone." "I didn't let him," I said, my chest tightening. "He chose to defend me." His eyes flickered, and for a brief moment he looked unsettled. "You've changed," he muttered. Something in his tone made my heart ache, because he didn't sound angry. He sounded uncertain. "I haven't changed," I said slowly. "I've just stopped pretending your words don't hurt." The air between us felt heavy. For years I had swallowed those truths. I had protected him from hearing them, even at the cost of my own pain. Now they hung openly between us, impossible to ignore. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "I was trying to prepare him." The words confused me. "For what?" I asked. "For reality," he replied stiffly. "Life is hard. People don't stay just because of feelings. They leave when things become difficult." His voice carried an edge of bitterness that caught me off guard. And suddenly, I understood something I had never fully realized before. He wasn't trying to destroy me. He was trying to protect himself from ever feeling that loss again. But in doing so, he had hurt me in ways he didn't even fully understand. "Dad, being sensitive isn't weakness. Loving deeply isn't something that makes people leave." He didn't respond. but his eyes softened slightly. Daniel didn't stay with me despite my feelings. He stayed because of them. A long silence stretched between us. For the first time in my life, it felt like we were standing not as adversaries, but as two people carrying different kinds of pain. He looked at me for a long time. Then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he said, "He spoke well." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had ever heard from him. And in that moment, I realized something unexpected. My father's regret had already begun. He just didn't know yet how deeply it would grow. Because later that night, something would happen that would force him to confront the full weight of what he had done. And when that moment came, it would change him in ways neither of us could have imagined. After that conversation outside the restaurant, my father and I stood in silence for a few seconds that felt strangely fragile, like thin ice beneath our feet. The cold night air wrapped around us, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and muffled laughter from guests still leaving the building behind us. He cleared his throat and adjusted his coat, his usual rigid composure slowly returning like armor sliding back into place. "You should go home," he said quietly. "It's late." There was no warmth in his voice, but there was no sharpness either, just distance. I nodded. "Good night, Dad." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return before turning away and walking toward his car. I watched him leave, feeling a heavy mixture of emotions pressing against my chest. For years, I had imagined a moment where we would finally understand each other, where something would shift between us. But this wasn't the resolution I had dreamed of. It felt more like standing at the edge of a long road whose end I couldn't see. Daniel stepped beside me, wrapping his arm gently around my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked softly. I leaned into him, letting myself rest in the warmth of his presence. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel tired." He kissed my temple. "That makes sense." As we drove home, the city lights blurred past the window, and exhaustion began to settle into my bones. The emotional storm of the evening had left me drained, like a house after a long, violent rain. When we finally reached Daniel's apartment, I changed into comfortable clothes and sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at my hands. "They're still shaking," I murmured. Daniel knelt in front of me, gently taking them in his. "You went through something painful tonight. Anyone would be shaken." I swallowed hard. Part of me still feels like a little girl standing there while he tells me I'm not good enough. His eyes softened. "You are not that little girl anymore." I looked at him, and tears stung my eyes again. Not from hurt this time, but from the deep relief of being seen. "You didn't have to say all those things tonight," I whispered. "Yes, I did," he replied calmly, "because they were true, and because you deserve to hear them." He brushed a tear from my cheek with his thumb. I leaned forward and wrapped him around him, holding on tightly. For the first time that night, my breathing finally began to slow. But peace didn't last long. About an hour later, just as I was starting to drift into a restless sleep, my phone vibrated on the bedside table. The sound cut sharply through the quiet room. I frowned and reached for it, expecting a late message from a friend checking in after the awkward evening. But when I saw the caller ID, my heart jolted. It was my father. He never called at night. In fact, he rarely called at all, unless it was something practical or urgent. A strange unease crept into my chest as I answered. "Hello?" For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then I heard something that startled me. My father's breathing. It sounded uneven, unsteady. "Dad?" I said, sitting upright. His voice came through, lower than I had ever heard it. "I need you to come." Fear shot through me instantly. "What happened?" There was a pause. I can't find something," he said, his words strangely strained. Relief flickered briefly. Maybe it was just something minor, but his tone didn't match something small. "What can't you find?" I asked. Another pause. Then he said quietly, "Your mother's letters." My chest tightened. I hadn't known those even still existed. "You had them?" I whispered. "Yes, I kept them locked away. I read them tonight after coming home." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. The sound shocked me more than anything else. My father didn't crack. He didn't falter. He certainly didn't sound lost. "What happened?" I asked gently. "They're gone," he said. A strange, hollow silence followed. "I don't understand," he continued, his voice unsteady. "I put them back in the drawer. Now they're not there." "Dad, maybe you just misplaced them," I said carefully. "No," he whispered. Then, after a long pause, he said something that made my breath catch. "I read them tonight for the first time in years." His voice lowered even more. "And I realized I misunderstood everything." A chill spread through me. "What do you mean?" I asked. He inhaled slowly. "She didn't leave because she was weak. She left because I thought I didn't love her." The words hit me like a quiet earthquake. My father had built his entire life on the belief that vulnerability destroyed people, that strength meant never showing softness. And now, in one night, that belief had cracked. "Dad?" I began softly, but he interrupted. "I said those things to you tonight because I thought I was protecting you," he whispered. "But now I think I was just protecting myself." His voice trembled again. "I need you to come," he repeated. "Please." I had never heard him say that word to me before. Please. A deep, complicated ache filled my chest. "I'm coming," I said quietly. As I hung up, Daniel sat up beside me, concern written across his face. "What is it?" I swallowed. "My father," I said. "Something's wrong." And as we hurried to get ready to leave, I had a strange, heavy feeling in my heart. The night that had begun with humiliation was far from over, because what I was about to discover in my father's house would reveal truths buried for decades. Truths that would change not only how I saw him, but how he finally saw me. The drive to my father's house felt longer than it actually was. The streets were nearly empty, washed in the pale glow of streetlights. But inside the car, my mind was racing with questions that had no clear answers. Daniel kept one hand resting gently on my knee as he drove, a silent reassurance that steadied me each time anxiety threatened to spiral. I had never heard my father sound the way he did on the phone, not when my mother left, not when he lost his job years ago, not even when he had been hospitalized briefly for a heart condition. He had always maintained an iron grip on his emotions. Tonight, that grip sounded like it had slipped completely. When we pulled into his driveway, I noticed something immediately unsettling. The porch light was on, but the front door stood slightly open. My stomach tightened. "Stay behind me," Daniel said quietly as he stepped out of the car first. I followed close, my heart pounding. The house was silent when we entered, except for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. The familiar scent of polished wood and old books hung in the air, unchanged from my childhood. "Dad?" I called softly. No answer. A flicker of fear moved through me, and I walked quickly toward his study at the end of the hallway. The door was half open, and a dim lamp cast a pool of yellow light inside. When I stepped into the doorway, I froze. My father sat on the floor beside his desk. Papers were scattered all around him like fallen leaves, covering the carpet, spilling from an open drawer that had clearly been emptied in desperation. And in his hands, he held a small, worn photograph. For a moment, I didn't recognize the man sitting there. His back was slightly hunched. His shoulders, always rigid and upright, looked heavy, weighed down by something invisible. His face was pale, his eyes red, his expression lost. He looked broken. "Dad," I whispered. He lifted his head slowly. When his eyes met mine, I saw something I had never seen in them before. Regret. Not the shallow kind that comes from embarrassment or wounded pride, but deep, aching remorse. "They're gone," he said quietly, his voice rough. "All of them." I stepped carefully over the scattered papers and knelt beside him. "What do you mean, gone?" "The letters," he repeated. "Your mother's letters." He held out the photograph. It showed my mother standing in our old garden, smiling gently, her eyes warm and soft. I hadn't seen that picture in years. "I read them tonight," he continued slowly. "She wrote to me for months after she moved out. I never answered." A painful silence filled the room. "What did they say?" I asked quietly. His fingers tightened around the photograph. "She kept saying she still loved me," he whispered. "She said she didn't leave because she stopped loving me. She left because she felt invisible, because I never told her how I felt, because I treated her kindness like weakness." Each word seemed to cost him effort, like he was forcing himself to face something he had spent decades avoiding. "She wrote that she was afraid I would treat you the same way," he added, his voice breaking slightly. "That you would grow up believing your feelings didn't matter." Tears filled my eyes. He lowered his head. "And I did exactly that," he said quietly. The weight of his words pressed heavily into the room. "I thought I was teaching you strength. I thought if I pushed you hard enough, you would never become fragile like her. I thought I was protecting you from being hurt." He let out a shaking breath. "But tonight, when Daniel spoke, when I saw your face," his voice faltered, "I realized I wasn't protecting you at all. I was hurting you in the same way I hurt her." The confession hung between us like a fragile truth finally exposed to light. I had imagined hearing an apology from my father many times in my life, but I had never imagined it sounding like this, quiet, raw, stripped of all pride. "What happened to the letters?" I asked gently. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I took them out, read them, then I don't remember." His confusion felt genuine, and it frightened me more than his anger ever had. Daniel stepped closer, scanning the scattered papers. "Maybe they got mixed in here," he said calmly. "Let's look together." For the next several minutes, we searched the floor carefully, lifting sheets of old documents, envelopes, and notebooks. My father sat motionless, watching us with hollow eyes. Then suddenly, Daniel paused. "I think I found something," he said softly. He held up a small bundle tied with faded blue ribbon. My father's breath caught. He reached out slowly, his hands trembling as he took the bundle. For a moment, he just stared at it, as though afraid to touch it again. Then he whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear. "I should have read these years ago." A deep, heavy silence filled the room. And as I watched him sitting there clutching those letters like something precious and fragile, I realized something that shifted the ground beneath my heart. My father's regret hadn't just begun tonight. It had been growing quietly inside him for decades. He just hadn't allowed himself to see it until now. But what he said next would reveal something even more painful, something that would force both of us to confront the truth about the years we had lost. My father sat there holding the bundle of letters like they were made of glass, his fingers trembling slightly against the faded ribbon. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of paper each time his grip shifted. For a long time he didn't speak. He just stared down at them, his expression heavy with something far deeper than sadness. It looked like grief that had been waiting years to surface. "I thought I understood everything," he said finally, his voice low and hoarse. "I thought I knew why she left. I told myself she couldn't handle life, that she chose weakness over responsibility." His jaw tightened slightly. "But these letters," he shook his head slowly, "they say something very different." I swallowed, feeling a knot forming in my throat. "What do they say?" He hesitated, as though the words themselves carried weight. "They say she begged me to open up. She begged me to tell her I loved her. She said she didn't need grand gestures. She just needed to know she mattered to me." His eyes lifted briefly to meet mine. "And I never said it," he added quietly. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of those unsaid words, words that had once had the power to save a marriage, to preserve a family. "What happened after she left?" I asked gently. His gaze drifted away again toward the wall, as though he were watching memories only he could see. "At first, I was angry," he admitted. "I told myself she abandoned us, that she was selfish, that she didn't care about you or me." His jaw tightened slightly, but it quickly softened again. "But after a while, the anger turned into something else." "What?" I whispered. "Silence," he said. The single word landed heavily. "I stopped talking about her. I locked away anything that reminded me of her. I convinced myself that feeling nothing was stronger than feeling pain." He exhaled slowly. "And when I looked at you, I saw too much of her." My chest tightened. "Your kindness," he continued quietly, "your sensitivity, your way of caring deeply about people. It reminded me of everything I had lost and everything I had failed to protect." He paused, his voice growing strained. "So I tried to toughen you. I thought if I hardened you enough, you would never end up hurt the way she did." Tears burned in my eyes. "But instead," he said softly, "I became the one who hurt you." The honesty in his voice felt almost unbearable. For so many years, I had longed for him to acknowledge the pain he had caused, and now that he was, the reality of it felt heavier than I ever imagined. "Dad," I said gently, "you didn't know how to handle your own pain. That doesn't make what you did right, but it explains it." He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. "Why are you being kind to me?" he asked quietly. "After everything I said tonight, after everything I've said your whole life." The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because I understand now," I said slowly. "You weren't trying to destroy me. You were trying to protect yourself from feeling the same loss again." His expression faltered. "And because," I added softly, "I don't want to carry anger the way you did. I've seen what it does to a person." A long silence followed. His gaze lowered again to the letters in his hands. "She wrote one about you," he murmured. My heart skipped. "What did she say?" He carefully untied the ribbon and opened the bundle, pulling out a single envelope that looked older than the others. "She wrote this when you were 8, he said quietly. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the paper inside. For a moment, he just stared at it, his lips pressing together. Then he read aloud in a voice barely above a whisper. She wrote, "Please don't let her grow up believing her feelings are a burden. She feels deeply because she loves deeply, and that is not a weakness, it is her greatest strength." The words hit me like a wave. Tears spilled freely down my cheeks. He lowered the letter slowly, his own eyes glistening. "She saw you so clearly," he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. "And I," his voice broke slightly, "spent years trying to turn you into someone you were never meant to be." The pain in his words felt raw, unfiltered. "You humiliated me tonight," he continued, his voice shaking. "I said things no father should ever say." He lifted his eyes to mine. "I don't know how to fix what I've done. I don't even know if I can." The vulnerability in his expression was something I had never seen before. It felt like standing in front of a completely different person. "You can't change the past," I said softly, "but you can choose what you do now." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he asked something that made my breath catch. "Is there still a place for me in your life?" The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy. For years, I had imagined walking away from him entirely, cutting the pain out of my life for good. But in that moment, looking at the man in front of me, not the cold, unyielding figure from my childhood, but a father finally confronting his mistakes, I realized something unexpected. He wasn't asking from pride. He was asking from fear. Fear of losing me the way he had lost my mother. And the answer I gave him would determine whether that fear became reality. My father's question lingered in the air between us, fragile and heavy, like something that could shatter if handled too quickly. "Is there still a place for me in your life?" For a moment I couldn't speak, because the truth was complicated. There had been so many nights growing up when I had imagined walking away from him completely, nights when I cried quietly into my pillow after harsh words, promising myself that one day, when I was strong enough, I would no longer need his approval or endure his coldness. And yet, despite all of that, he was still my father. The man who taught me how to ride a bicycle when I was 6, running behind me down the street until I found my balance. The man who stayed up all night outside my hospital room when I had pneumonia as a child, even though he never once said he was worried. The man who worked long hours to make sure I had opportunities he never did. His love had always been there. It had just been buried under fear, pride, and unspoken pain. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "Yes," I said quietly. His eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected that answer. "But," I continued gently, "I can't keep pretending your words hurt. I can't keep trying to earn your approval by changing who I am. If you want to be in my life, it has to be as someone who respects me." The room fell silent again. I could see him processing my words, his mind working through something unfamiliar, something he had never had to face before. Respect. For most of his life, he had believed respect was something earned through strength, control, and authority, not something given freely through understanding and acceptance. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted quietly, "but I want to try." Those words carried more sincerity than any promise he had ever made before. and something inside my chest loosened just a little. Daniel stepped forward then, his presence calm and steady as always. "Trying is a good place to start," he said gently. My father looked at him, and for a moment the tension between them flickered again, but it was different now, less sharp, less defensive. "You care about her," my father said quietly. Daniel nodded. "More than anything." A long pause followed. Then my father said something that surprised both of us. "I misjudged you," he admitted. The words seemed difficult for him, like they had to force their way past years of stubborn pride. He continued, "I thought you were naive. I thought you didn't understand how hard life can be." His gaze dropped briefly before lifting again. "But tonight, you showed more strength than I have seen in many men." Daniel didn't respond right away. Then he said calmly, "Strength doesn't always mean being unbreakable. Sometimes it means choosing to be kind even when it's easier to be cruel." My father absorbed those words silently, and for the first time I saw something in his expression that looked like humility. "I am sorry," he said quietly, turning back to me. The words were simple, but they felt monumental, because my father had never apologized to me before, not once in my entire life. Tears filled my eyes again. "I know," I whispered. He hesitated, then added softly, "I should have said it a long time ago." The weight of those years pressed heavily into the room. "But you're saying it now," I replied gently, and somehow that mattered. He looked down at the letters in his hands again, his fingers tracing the edges carefully. "I wasted so much time," he murmured. "Time can't be wasted if you learn from it," Daniel said quietly. My father glanced at him again, and this time there was something new in his gaze. Respect. Not complete, not fully formed, but present. "I would like to know you better," he said slowly, "if you're willing." Daniel nodded. "I'd like that too." A quiet peace settled into the room then. Not perfect, not complete, but real. For the first time in my life, it felt like we were standing on equal ground instead of opposite sides of an invisible battlefield. And as I watched my father carefully retie the ribbon around my mother's letters, I realized something profound. The humiliation he had caused me at the engagement party had forced something open inside him that had been sealed shut for decades. It had hurt me deeply, but it had also forced him to confront truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. And that confrontation was only the beginning, because the days that followed would bring challenges neither of us expected. Challenges that would test whether this fragile understanding between us could truly grow into something stronger, or whether old habits and old wounds would pull us apart once again. The days after that night felt strangely quiet, like the calm that follows a storm when everything still looks the same on the surface, but something deep underneath has shifted. I expected awkwardness. I expected distance. I even expected my father to retreat back into his old habits, to pretend the vulnerability of that night had never happened. But he didn't. 3 days later, my phone rang in the afternoon while I was at work. When I saw his name on the screen, my chest tightened automatically, a reflex built from years of conditioning. I answered carefully, "Hello?" There was a brief pause, and then his voice came through, steady but softer than it used to be. "I wanted to ask if you have time this weekend," he said. "I thought maybe we could have lunch." The request startled me, not because it was unusual for parents to invite their children to lunch, but because my father had never done that before. Our interactions had always been practical, necessary, formal, never simply intentional. "Yes," I replied after a moment. "I'd like that." When the call ended, I sat staring at my phone for a long time. It felt like the beginning of something fragile and unfamiliar. That weekend, I arrived at his house with a strange mixture of hope and anxiety swirling inside me. Daniel had offered to come with me, but I knew this was something my father and I needed to navigate on our own first. When I walked inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Fresh food. He was in the kitchen, cooking. I stopped in the doorway, stunned. In all my life, I had never seen him cook a meal, not once. Growing up, meals had always been simple, functional, often prepared by someone else or picked up quickly without ceremony. But now he stood at the stove, carefully stirring a pot, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked up when he noticed me. "You're here," he said quietly. There was something almost nervous in his tone. "Yes," I replied, stepping inside. He nodded toward the table. "Lunch is almost ready." As I sat down, I realized something else. The house felt different, not physically, but emotionally. For years, it had felt like a place filled with unspoken tension, where silence carried weight and every word felt measured. Now there was still silence, but it didn't feel as heavy. It felt thoughtful. When he brought the food to the table, I recognized the dishes immediately. They were my favorites from childhood, meals my mother used to cook. The realization hit me softly but powerfully. "You remembered," I whispered. He hesitated, then nodded. "I always remembered. I just never made them before." We ate in quiet for a few minutes, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like two people slowly learning how to share space without walls between them. Finally, he spoke. "I've been reading her letters," he said. I looked up. "Every night," he continued. "There were things she wrote that I refused to see before." He paused, his gaze resting on the cable. "She said love isn't something you prove through control. It's something you show through understanding." His voice carried a faint edge of regret. He said, "I spent years believing I was strong, but I see now that I was just afraid of being vulnerable." I swallowed, feeling a deep ache in my chest. "You weren't the only one afraid," I said gently. He looked at me. "I was afraid too," I continued, "afraid that no matter what I did, I would never be enough for you." The words hung between us, raw and honest. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he said something that made my throat tighten. "You were always enough." His voice was quiet but steady. "I just didn't know how to show it." Tears filled my eyes again, because those were the words I'd waited my entire life to hear. And even though they came years later than I wished, they still reached something deep inside me. "I wish you had told me sooner," I whispered. "So do I." A long silence followed, but this time it felt like healing rather than distance. Before I left that afternoon, he stopped me near the door. "He's got something else," he said. I turned to face him. "I want to apologize properly," he continued. "Not just to you, but to Daniel." I blinked, surprised. "He didn't deserve the way I spoke that night," my father added quietly, "and I want him to know that I see now how wrong I was." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "That would mean a lot," I said softly. He nodded slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness quickly," he continued. "I know trust takes time." Then he said something that stayed with me long after I left. "But I don't want to spend the rest of my life silent," he said quietly. "Not anymore." As I drove home that day, I felt something inside me shift again. For the first time, I wasn't just seeing my father as the man who hurt me. I was seeing him as a human being learning, late, imperfectly, but genuinely. And yet, I also knew something important. Healing wasn't a single moment, it was a process. Because just when it felt like things were finally beginning to settle, something unexpected would happen that would test how real this change really was. Something that would force us both to confront whether the past could truly stay in the past, or whether old wounds still had the power to reopen. About 2 weeks after that lunch, life began to feel almost normal again, at least as normal as it could after everything that had happened. Daniel and I were busy with wedding planning. My father called occasionally, sometimes just to ask how my day was. Those conversations were still slightly awkward, filled with pauses and careful words, but each one felt like a small step forward. He even met Daniel for coffee once. I had been nervous about that meeting, worried old tensions might resurface. But when they returned, Daniel told me quietly, "He's trying. You can see it." And I could. He listened more than he spoke now. He didn't interrupt. He asked questions about Daniel's work, about our plans, about things that showed genuine interest rather than judgment. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Then one evening, everything shifted again. I had just come home from work when my phone rang. It was my aunt, my father's older sister. Her voice sounded urgent. "Have you spoken to your father today?" she asked. "No," I replied, my stomach tightening instantly. "Why?" There was a pause. "He collapsed this afternoon," she said quietly. The words hit me like a sudden drop in the floor beneath my feet. "What?" I whispered. "He's at the hospital," she continued. "They think it's stress-related, maybe his heart." My mind went blank for a moment. "I'm coming," I said quickly. The drive to the hospital felt unreal. My hands trembled so badly Daniel had to hold the steering wheel at one point while I tried to steady myself. Fear settled heavily in my chest, not just fear of losing him, but fear of unfinished things, because despite the progress we had made, there were still so many years of distance between us, so many conversations we had never had. When we arrived, I rushed through the hospital corridors until I found his room. He lay in the bed, pale and still, connected to monitoring machines that beeped softly in the quiet room. Seeing him like that, so fragile, so unlike the strong, imposing figure of my childhood, felt like a sharp ache spreading through my chest. I stepped closer slowly. His eyes opened when he heard me. For a moment, confusion flickered in his gaze, then recognition. "You came," he said softly. "Of course I came," I replied, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. He watched me quietly, and I saw something in his expression that looked almost like relief. "You scared me," he murmured. "Yes," I admitted. "You did." A faint, tired smile touched his lips. "I suppose I deserve that," he said. I shook my head quickly. "Don't say that." A long silence followed. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter than ever. "When I collapsed, I thought of one thing." My throat tightened. "What?" I whispered. "That I might not get another chance to tell you how proud I am of you." Tears filled my eyes instantly. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. His hand moved weakly across the bed, and I took it carefully. "You built a life," he continued slowly. "You found someone who truly sees you. You stayed kind despite everything I did to harden you." His voice trembled slightly. "That is strength, real strength." The words settled into my heart with a warmth that felt healing and heartbreaking. "I wasted so many years believing the wrong things," he added quietly, "believing that love had to be hidden to be safe." He swallowed hard. "But now I see, hiding love is the fastest way to lose it." Tears slipped down my cheeks. "You haven't lost it. You still have me." His fingers tightened around mine slightly. Do you? Do you? He asked fragilely. Yes, I said firmly. You do. A long silence followed, filled with the soft rhythm of the heart monitor. Then he said something that felt like the final wall between us breaking. I wish I had stood up at your engagement party and said what Daniel said, he whispered. I shook my head gently. You couldn't have, I replied softly. Not then. Why not? He asked. Because you weren't ready to see me that way yet. He closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing the truth of that. And now? He asked quietly. I squeezed his hand. Now you are. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, and in that moment I realized something profound. The humiliation he caused me at that party had forced him to face truths he had avoided his entire life. It had nearly broken me, but it had also saved something between us that might otherwise have been lost forever. As I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand, I understood something clearly for the first time. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it can transform what the past means. And what happened next would prove just how deeply that transformation had taken root. Because my father would soon do something no one in our family ever expected. Something that would show beyond any doubt how much he truly changed. My father was discharged from the hospital 3 days later. The doctors said his collapse had been brought on by extreme stress, exhaustion, and years of quietly carrying emotional weight he had never allowed himself to release. In other words, his body had finally forced him to confront what his heart had avoided for decades. When I drove him home that afternoon, he seemed quieter than usual, but not in the cold, distant way I had known all my life. This silence felt thoughtful, almost gentle, like he was moving carefully through his own thoughts. As we stepped inside the house, he paused in the entryway and looked around slowly. I spent years building this place to feel strong, he said quietly, solid, unshakable. He glanced toward the study down the hallway. But now I realize it mostly felt empty. His words carried no bitterness, just quiet understanding. I didn't respond right away. Sometimes silence was the most honest companion to truth. Over the next week, he recovered steadily. I visited often, bringing meals, sitting with him while he talked, sometimes about the past, sometimes about small, everyday things that once would have seemed too trivial for him to bother with. Then one evening, as I was preparing to leave, he stopped me near the front door. "There's something I want to do," he said. I turned to face him. "What is it?" He hesitated briefly, as though gathering courage. "I want to speak at your wedding." The words surprised me so much I blinked. "You don't have to," I began automatically. "I know I don't have to," he said gently, "but I need to." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet urgency beneath it. "I humiliated you publicly. I spoke words that no father should ever say about his child." He held my gaze. "And I want to stand in front of everyone and tell the truth instead." My chest tightened. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," I said softly. "I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for you and for myself." A long silence followed. Then I nodded slowly. "Okay," I whispered. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I could see how seriously he took that promise. He spent time writing, rewriting, and practicing what he wanted to say. Sometimes he asked me questions about my childhood, memories he had never bothered to explore before. Each conversation felt like uncovering pieces of a story we had never fully shared. Finally, the wedding day arrived. It was a beautiful afternoon, warm and bright, with soft sunlight filtering through the trees at the outdoor venue. Guests filled the space with laughter and excitement, their voices carrying a lightness that felt worlds away from the tension of that engagement party months earlier. As I stood beside Daniel during the ceremony, I glanced toward the front row where my father sat. He looked nervous, but not rigid, not guarded, just human. When the reception began later that evening, the moment eventually came for speeches. My heart pounded as my father stood and walked toward the microphone. The entire room grew quiet. He looked out at the guests, his hands steady but his expression filled with emotion. "I've never been very good with words," he began quietly. A soft ripple of knowing laughter moved through the room. "But tonight, I want to try." He paused, his gaze finding mine. "For most of my life, I believed strength meant hiding your feelings. I believed love was something you showed through control, through protection, through making sure the people you cared about never appeared weak." His voice grew heavier. "And because of that belief, I hurt the person I should have protected the most." The room fell completely silent. "I said things at her engagement party that I can never take back. Cruel things, untrue things." He swallowed hard. "I told her no man would want her." A soft murmur moved through the guests, many of whom were present that night. He lifted his head. "But the truth is, any man would be fortunate to love her." Tears filled my eyes instantly. "My daughter is compassionate. She is resilient. She is kind in a world that often rewards hardness. She forgave me when I did not deserve it." His voice trembled slightly. "And she taught me something I should have learned long ago, that real strength is not found in silence or control." He paused, his gaze steady and clear. "It is found in love that is spoken openly." He turned slightly toward Daniel. "And to the man who had the courage to stand up for her when I could not see her clearly, thank you." The room erupted into gentle applause. Then he looked back at me. "I am proud of you," he said softly. The words felt like sunlight breaking through years of shadow. "And I am grateful that you gave me the chance to learn how to be your father again." Tears streamed freely down my face, because in that moment I knew something with absolute certainty. He had changed, not perfectly, not instantly, but deeply and genuinely. And what he did next would leave an impression on my heart that would last for the rest of my life. Because as he stepped away from the microphone, he walked toward me, placed his hand over mine, and whispered something only I could hear. Something that completed a healing I had waited for my entire life. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of music, laughter, and warm congratulations. But for me, the world had shifted. My father's words lingered in my mind, wrapping around my heart like a balm that I had waited decades to feel. For the first time, I didn't feel like a child standing in the shadow of someone else's judgment. I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt loved. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Daniel and I sat at one of the small tables near the edge of the dance floor. I was quiet, my fingers intertwined with his. He leaned close and whispered, "You okay?" I smiled through tears. I've never felt more okay in my life. Then I noticed my father standing nearby, watching us. His expression was soft, almost tentative, and yet full of pride. It struck me as odd at first, because for years I had been conditioned to look for criticism in his gaze, not tenderness. But tonight there was no critique, only love, only a quiet acknowledgement that he finally understood. He approached slowly and crouched beside us. His voice was low, gentle, and unlike any I had ever heard from him before. "I don't want to intrude," he said, "but I want you to know I see you, all of you, every part, the parts I criticized, the parts I misunderstood. I see them now, and I'm proud of who you are." My chest tightened, and I blinked rapidly, unable to stop the tears that fell freely now. "Dad," I started, my voice trembling. Words failed me because they couldn't capture decades of pain, longing, and now relief. "I know I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I can be better now. I want to be a father you're proud to have." I reached up and hugged him, holding him tightly. He was hesitant at first, but then his arms wrapped around me, solid and warm. In that embrace, I felt a lifetime of hurt begin to loosen, not entirely gone, but softened by acknowledgement and love. We sat together quietly for a few minutes, the music from the hall washing over us, voices echoing laughter and happiness around us. And in that silence, I realized something powerful. Healing isn't about erasing pain. It's about creating space for love to exist alongside it, allowing the broken pieces to form something stronger. Later, as Daniel and I danced, my father stayed close, watching quietly, and I noticed a rare smile spreading across his face, warm, unguarded, and sincere. It was a look I had always longed to see, not the imposing, judgmental man of my childhood, but a father who had faced his own fears and regrets and emerged, however imperfectly, willing to love. After the last song, my father walked over to me again. "I want to say one more thing," he said quietly, "something I should have said a long time ago." I held my breath. "You are worthy of love," he said, his voice steady now. "Not because of what you do or how you behave, not because of anyone else, but because you are you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." I felt my knees go weak as tears streamed freely, but this time they were different. They were not tears of shame, humiliation, or fear. They were tears of release, of closure, of recognition that despite everything, the man I had feared would never change had changed in the most important way. I took a deep breath and smiled through the tears. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. He nodded, and for the first time our eyes met without judgment, without doubt, without the heavy weight of unspoken words, only understanding, only love. As the night wound down, I found myself reflecting on the journey we had taken, on the humiliation, the anger, the despair, and the eventual confrontation that had forced both of us to face our truths. I realized that the worst moments in life sometimes serve as the catalyst for the greatest change. The words my father spoke that night at my engagement were cruel, but they forced a reckoning. They forced honesty. They forced growth. And in that growth, I found not only reconciliation with him, but also a deeper understanding of myself. I learned that I could stand tall in my truth, that I could set boundaries and demand respect, and that love, real love, was not fragile. It was resilient. It survived hurt, survived mistakes, and could flourish if nurtured honestly. In the quiet of that night, as I looked around the emptying hall, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Daniel, for standing by me without hesitation. Gratitude for my friends and family who supported me quietly through years of struggle. And even gratitude for my father, whose mistakes had carved the path that ultimately brought us here, closer than we had ever been before. When I finally lay down that night, exhausted but at peace, I realized something that seemed impossible before. The past could not be erased, but its pain could be transformed into wisdom, compassion, and connection. And with that transformation came freedom, the freedom to love, to forgive, and to finally accept that we are all human, flawed, and learning as we go. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the day settle gently. For the first time in my life, I slept without fear, without shame, and without longing for approval. I slept knowing that my Father had finally seen me, fully, and that was enough. Because sometimes the greatest lessons in life come not from perfection, but from the courage to face our failures, to apologize, to change, and to open our hearts again, even when it's long overdue. And that night, I felt that courage and that love more clearly than ever before. The journey wasn't easy, it wasn't neat, but it was ours, and it had brought us here, healed enough to truly start anew, together.